In animation, the Microsoft logo bursts into clear concentric windows. Colorful, rounded fabric squares converge, spiraling upward. Microsoft. Ability Summit, 2023 Disability Policy, Defining Our Futures. Rylan Rogers, Microsoft.
Hello, my name is Rylan Rogers, and I'm the Disability Policy Advisor here at Microsoft. I'm incredibly excited for this session and this conversation. At Microsoft, we believe accessibility is a fundamental right, and together we need to do work to make sure that every person, over 1 billion of us who have disabilities globally, have access to that right. I'm really excited today because we're going to dive into the conversation about disability policy and how it is critical to addressing the gaps in our services, our lives, employment, and the way we live. This conversation will bring voices from the community and advocacy from different perspectives and really give us things to think about in terms of how businesses, employers, and the community can work together to drive policy change. At this point, I don't want to wait any longer, and I want to give you a chance to meet our amazing panelists. I'm going to ask each one of them to introduce themselves, share their current role, and what they believe the role that they believe companies should play in disability and accessibility policy. Maria, can you start us off?
Maria Town.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rylan, and thank you to Microsoft for the opportunity to be here. My name is Maria Town. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I serve as the president and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities, a national cross-disability civil rights organization dedicated to advancing the political and economic power of the more than 61 million disabled people across the United States. And when I think about the role that companies can play in disability and accessibility policy, I am reminded of the fact that 69 of the world's 100 largest economies are companies, not nations, but companies. And so companies, in the policies that they adopt in terms of their employment practices, their commitments to accessibility, really can provide an example for nations, for communities, and for other organizations to follow. And for us to achieve global inclusion, it will require all three entities, private corporations, governments, and public partners like AAPD, Dominant New Disabled South, and Alejandro with the European Union, European Disability Union to work together. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks for being here. Dom?
Dom Kelly.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, Rylan and Microsoft. My name is Dom Kelly. I use he, him pronouns. I am the founder, president, and CEO of New Disabled South, as well as the co-founder, president, and CEO of our 501c4 arm, New Disabled South Rising. We are an organization working in 14 southern states to advance disability justice and disability rights, focus on policy change and narrative change in the South. When I think about how companies can advance disability policy and accessibility, I think it really starts right at home for them and how they treat their employees. I read a news article today about a woman in Florida who was discriminated against by her employer, a large corporation, very wealthy corporation, that did not accommodate her needs as an employee and forced her out of the company, and she's now filing a lawsuit. But I think about all of the other disabled people who don't have the means to be able to file a lawsuit against a massive corporation. So it really starts at home. It really starts with employers putting into practice. This is a corporation that scored very high as one of the top employers for people with disabilities and still discriminated against the disabled employees. So it really starts at home, and it really starts with how companies treat their employees.
Alejandro Moleda.
Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Rylan, and many thanks to Microsoft for inviting us to participate in the Ability Summit. It's an honor to be here. My name is Alejandro Moledo, and I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Policy at the European Disability Forum, EDF in short. And we are the umbrella organization that brings together the European disability movement. So those European disability organizations representing the different communities, the different disability groups, such as the European Blind Union, the European Union of the Deaf, the European Federation of Hard of Hearing, Autism Europe, Inclusion Europe, people with intellectual disabilities, and also those organizations at national level that represent the disability movement in their countries. So we bring together this big family, and our mission is to ensure that the EU, the European Union, as a supranational government, and all member states really implement the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We've been working together with our members in these different policy levels to ensure the advancement on disability rights in all fields possible. And when we think of how companies can cooperate with the disability movement in advancing disability rights, well, it's first of all, I would say that for non-profit organizations like us and for most of our members, obviously the support in a way of funding and resources is obviously very much appreciated. But I also believe that companies can contribute with accessible tools, accessible services, with really inclusive employment policies, as it was already mentioned, and also to bring their expertise in their different fields to the OPDs, to organizations of persons with disabilities, to advance on those areas in the different domains, and also to build the bridges with other companies that are not yet with this change in their mindset on how to include persons with disabilities and to be inclusive towards persons with disabilities. So building these connections, not only with policymakers, which obviously from the advocacy organizations we reach out to, but also with other companies, other sectors, is crucial for us to really spread the word and make sure that inclusion and accessibility are really embraced by all actors of society.
I think you all can see why I'm so excited. It's great to have such diverse perspectives. We haven't quite spanned the globe, but we really are thinking about disability policy from lots of different perspectives. Maria doing great work across the United States, Dom doing state and regional work, and then Alejandro giving us perspective from the European Union. So thank you all so much for being here. Today, we've been spending a lot of time talking about technology. It's the Microsoft Ability Summit. And of course, my bias is that policy goes with everything, but absolutely in the last several years, we've really seen how disability policies live and intersect with technology and people. And at Microsoft, we believe that there's real power in technology to break down barriers or obstacles so that people can reach their goals, their individual potential, what we want out of life. So I'd love to dig in a little bit to your thoughts about sort of disability impacts and technology policy. I'll start again with Maria to see if you can share any specific U.S. policies. Where do you think technology has a role in shaping or enhancing accessibilities? And are there other policies that we should be considering?
Absolutely. So I know everyone here will agree that technology has become ubiquitous in every aspect of American life. And so there is no area, right, where investing in and enhancing, committing to accessible technology, equitable technology doesn't make a positive difference for disabled people. And one of the areas where I could see the US doing more is on making it possible for people with disabilities to have easier access to connected devices. And I know Dom is going to talk about the digital divide that disabled people face, and I want to talk about the device gap. So we've made some gains getting people connected to the internet, and through policies like the American Rescue Plan and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, right? We've gotten some subsidized broadband connectivity programs and the Affordable Connectivity Program. But for disabled people, we are way less likely to own a laptop or a tablet or a smartphone. And if we do, we're more likely to have limited access to the data that those devices use. And so the potential for these programs that subsidize broadband connectivity is lost. And right now, unless you are a person with a disability who is in a vocational rehabilitation program, there is no way for you to get access to a device either for free or for a subsidized cost. And many people with disabilities rely on other forms of assistive technologies in order for them to use those devices. Those assistive technologies come, again, at an additional cost. And we know that disabled people are more likely to live in poverty. They're, in fact, more than twice as likely to live in poverty than people without disabilities. And we also have higher day-to-day costs. And so one of the things that I would like to see the United States be open to are policies that support, again, access to devices and subsidized device costs so that disabled people can actually benefit from internet connectivity and all of the barrier breaking that technology does in our day-to-day lives.
I love that reframe about what is that last mile. We often talked about it in terms of connectivity, but you're raising a really interesting point around the other parts of the last mile. Dom, from your perspective, in terms of regional and state work, what are you seeing in terms of technology policy?
Sure. So, Maria kind of pointed to what I was really going to focus on. This question was the digital divide, and particularly in our southern states, where Maria talked about the poverty statistics in this country. The states with the highest poverty rates are here in the South, and the vast majority of those people are Black and brown people with disabilities living in rural parts of all of our southern states. So in those parts of our states, there are enormous numbers of people who do not have access to broadband internet connection. We know that 1 in 3 Black people in the South lack internet access at home. And I know here in Georgia, where I live, it's a big issue. We've got 1.6 million Georgians who do not have access to a broadband internet connection. About 40% of those people live in areas with one internet provider alone. That's, when you compare it to Texas, Texas has got 9 million Texans without internet access. Almost a quarter of the people in the state of South Carolina don't have internet access. So what we really need to see, and what I hope we can see at the state and local level, is prioritization of getting people access to the internet. It should not be up to people who have the means to be able to afford an internet plan. A public utility at this point in the year 2023, it should be a given that internet access is necessary to be able to live day to day, especially for disabled people. There are no bills right now that are addressing this in the South. Like we're tracking policy throughout we work in 14 states in the South. There are no bills right now that are looking at any sort of funding for public broadband internet access. There is a bill in Virginia, it's SB 1322, that's looking at adding language into their state code on creating healthy communities. Part of that is increasing access to affordable broadband internet, but there's no specific plans to be able to do that. There's a bill in Mississippi that's working on improving opportunities for students to learn remotely at home, but how can they learn remotely at home if they don't have access to an internet connection? So I really think that I think Maria's focus on having access to actual devices is so critical. And we also need that to couple with that, the opportunity for people to actually access the internet in general. It shouldn't be left up to the number of nonprofit organizations that I know of that are working throughout the South to raise money to provide internet access to people. Our government should be the ones who are providing this. And I hope that we can continue at the state and local level and hopefully at the federal level to look at how we increase broadband access for people with disabilities across the country.
Thanks so much. It was nice to sort of see those two pieces come together. Alejandra, I had the pleasure of getting to know you working on technology policy and what's happening in the European Union. So would love to hear sort of your perspective on what's happening and what more needs to be done.
Thanks a lot. And I think it can complement very well what Maria and Dan had mentioned, because when we talk about the intersection between technology and persons with disabilities, we always remind policymakers and we talk publicly about it, that people with disabilities, we are early adopters of technology, and actually thanks to the innovation that many innovations that were thought for persons with disabilities, then they were actually adopted by a wider range of users. So having this disability inclusion or perspective in mind when developing technologies and policies related to technologies, we know that they have a direct positive effect on the whole society. So when we talk about persons with disabilities and technology, a mantra that we've been repeating over and over again, and actually Maria and Dan mentioned, is that for us to really take advantage of technologies need to comply with a AAA condition. They need to be technologies need to be available, they need to be affordable, and they need to be accessible. And Dan and Maria, they've mentioned availability and affordability, and also the importance of the infrastructure, the access to the bandwidth and access to the internet. And I think this is something that we know that this is something that also affects Europeans with disabilities, the less access to the internet. And we are tackling this with European legislation in this matter because fortunately, this is one of the key priorities of the European Union at the moment, the digital transition, as well as the green transition, obviously. So they are tackling these aspects as well. And when we talk about accessibility, as you know, also the precondition for us to be able to use technologies, we've seen that it really had an impact on national policies such as employment, education, rehabilitation, which are a competence of the member states of the European Union, but also at European level, as I was mentioning, since we have a common and hard rules, let's say, on our single internal market, even if we are 27 member states. The EU has managed to introduce very important legislation tackling these aspects on electronic communications, for example, in which we included the obligation as a universal service. Therefore, it must be provided in all countries of the EU for the availability and affordability of electronic communications, meaning access to the internet, for example, but also access to assistive technologies. In the past, these were, for example, the text telephonies. Now, with the recent legislation, it will be real-time text, for example. So we tackled electronic communications, access to information and media, the digitalization of the public sector, with not only the websites and mobile application, but also to go beyond using public procurement laws, and also the most recent and let's say turning point for Europe when it comes to accessible technologies is the adoption of a law known as the European Accessibility Act. And this is really the legislation, the key policy that has made us finally, we are now catching up as for the compared to the US on accessibility requirements and having this strong legal framework for accessibility. And we hope that with this legislation, we will tackle the technologies that, as Maria mentioned, is ubiquitous in many sectors. So it covers from transport to banking, to e-books, payment terminals, ATMs, access to audiovisual media services, access to the emergency communication, which unfortunately is still not accessible in Europe. So we really hope that this is a turning point for Europe when it comes to accessibility and technologies.
I have to say, I don't think you're catching up. I think you're leading the way in terms of regulation and laws related to accessible. So it's exciting to see and watch. And I also loved the coordination there. So thanks for each of you hitting parts of the AAA. I feel like we have the real powerful minds working in sync here. One of the areas that I'm lucky enough to get to work on is employment policy. Microsoft has a stated commitment to addressing the unemployment gap, which exists in the United States and frankly everywhere in the world, where people with disabilities are less likely to be employed than people without disabilities. And even when we are employed, we are more likely to be underemployed and not bringing our full talents to the global economy. And it's one of the areas that's been incredibly important to address policy because Microsoft hiring will not solve the problem on its own. I'm pleased that one of the areas where we've leaned in is to take a position in support of ending something that exists in the United States called subminimum wage, or 14C. But we're looking at other blockers to employment in terms of income and asset limits. So I would love to hear a little bit from each of your perspectives about what are the policy changes needed to address that employment gap and make sure the talents of all of us are contributing to our communities. Just to mix it up a little bit, let's have Alejandro start and we'll go in reverse order.
Thank you, Railing. Well, the employment rate of persons with disabilities in Europe is also lower than of the non-disabled people, 25%. There is the employment gap, and unfortunately, the employment rate of women and with disabilities is worse as for men with disabilities. But beyond that, it's also important to look at the activation rates, because only 60% of persons with disabilities are active in the open labor market, compared to 80% of non-disabled people. So if we take these two rates into consideration, the conclusion is quite frustrating and disappointing. And less than one out of three persons with disabilities have actually a job in the EU. So these are employment policies are national competence. We see that unfortunately there are still a number of European countries that consider shelter employment as a potential solution that they should invest on, and there is not a clear transition towards the open labor market. But even if we have a legislation concerning non-discrimination in employment, the situation differs greatly from country to country. And the EU, from the EU, what we are trying to do is, well, encourage the European institutions to do, because as EDF we can not, we do our advocacy, we do our best, but it's obviously up to the European Commissions and mostly the national governments to really pick up our recommendations, is to develop those supporting materials and supporting guidance that can lead employers and public authorities to increase the employment rate of persons with disabilities. And the way the Commission, for example, has tackled this, they recently launched the employment package for persons with disabilities, with some interesting activities that we are involved in their development, such as, for example, a toolkit for public employment services on how to become inclusive, how to become more accessible to persons with disabilities so they can also support them in finding a job. And a study on how to transition from this shelter employment to the open labor market. A set of recommendations on affirmative actions, the different measures put in place at national level, such as quotas, etc., to facilitate the employment of persons with disabilities. And one that is very interesting for us, which is guidance on the provision of reasonable accommodation, because this is something that creates quite a big confusion among employers, what it means, what is the difference between accessibility and reasonable accommodation, what should I do before having an employee with disability, what should I do if I want to hire an employee with a disability. So with this, we want to ensure that member states and employers, they have the tools and the common understanding on what reasonable accommodation means. And for example, here we can bring the potential that accessible technologies are having actually in different fields on ensuring that persons with disabilities can really exercise their jobs on equal footing with others. Because sometimes reasonable accommodation is only thought of like, okay, assistive technology, but no, maybe having an accessible mainstream piece of technology will be enough to make persons with disabilities being able to participate equally in the company, for example. So all these aspects we are kind of trying to bring in and build, the consensus and the understanding around these different conflicting areas.
I really appreciate that you called out the additional disparity for disabled women. It's such an important point as we're having this conversation on the International Day of Women for the Ability Summit. So thank you for making that connection. Dom, would love to hear about your perspective as you're tackling this real gap in employment in the South.
Yeah, absolutely. So you touched on it, Rylan. Subminimum wage is a massive issue in this country and here in the South. A quarter of 14C holders are here in the South, and oftentimes CEOs of some of these companies will make six figures while paying their employees with disabilities pennies on the dollar, and it is keeping our people in poverty. It is not giving them the opportunity to be in the general workforce, and so there have been some gains. A couple of states in our region have ended subminimum wage and sheltered workshops. There's a bill right now in West Virginia that would end subminimum wage and would create an employment first policy. And employment first would mean that it gives the opportunity for people with disabilities to work in the general workforce first. And then there's also a bill in Virginia that would basically require that anyone who's currently making subminimum wage in Virginia would have to be making the minimum wage, which I think is $12 an hour, within the next 3 years. So we need to see states. We need to see states push for this. We need to see states introduce this legislation and this practice now. There's a push here in Georgia right now among advocates to get this done. Hopefully this legislative session. But it is a big issue. You talked about asset limits; those hold people back from being able to get jobs. But another thing that came to mind, and I think it kind of goes back to the very first thing that I talked about when I introduced myself, was like employers, especially big employers like Microsoft and others, should really start to look at themselves and their own policies and practices. It's fantastic for companies to stand against practices like subminimum wage, but if they are contributing to politicians who are actively standing in the way of eliminating policies like subminimum wage, then it's actually not doing any good. So they should look at their own policies and practices. Also, there are ways to make the employment processes way more accessible and give opportunities to people who might not normally have them. Requiring college degrees for certain jobs can be very limiting for people with disabilities. The vast majority of college students with disabilities do not actually get a bachelor's degree at the end of their time in college. I think 1 out of 3 who enroll in a 4-year college graduate within 8 years. So that's a very low statistic for our community. So being more creative and thoughtful about the people that you recruit for jobs, who you interview, and the barriers that are being put in place, I think are really important things that companies can continue to do to advance the hiring of people with disabilities, and not just think about those with degrees, not just think about those with specializations, but those from a variety of backgrounds.
Thanks. I love that sort of actions for companies, actions for policy, and the reality that it's going to take all of those pieces. Maria, thoughts about other federal efforts that could help to address employment?
Yes, and I actually want to take a step back because we've used the phrase asset limits, and just being aware of who our audience is today, I want to explain what that means. So when you are a person with a disability, a low-income person, often that's one and the same, and you receive federal benefits, whether that's Social Security disability insurance, Medicaid, SNAP, what we used to call food stamps, right? Those are all based around how many assets you have, how much money you have. And there is a limit to how many assets you can have to remain eligible for those programs. And oftentimes when it's a program like Medicaid or Supplemental Security Income or SSI, that program comes with the healthcare and supports that you need to survive. And in fact, it is so expensive in any other realm that oftentimes the only way people with disabilities can access the supports we need is to be on benefits, which means that we cannot have a good, well-paying job with benefits at a company like Microsoft, right? And so when Rylan says that as a company, Microsoft has come out and said we need to increase asset limits, that's enormous, because what it means to me as an advocate is that Microsoft understands that systematized disability poverty is a workforce development issue. These policies, like asset limits, force disabled people to stay in poverty and keep us out of the labor force. And sometimes it's not just about a job, it's about the quality of job. It's about an ability to have a career. So if I'm a disabled person trying to get a job, knowing that even getting some of the lowest paying jobs in this country will risk my benefit status, why would I take that risk knowing that I could easily be fired, right? Recently, the Family Medical Leave Act turned 30, and the FMLA, right, guarantees job security if you get sick or if you have to care for a sick loved one. And data shows that people with disabilities often need more leave, not only to manage our own health, but to care for our own families, because we're parents too, right? We have parents too. And I was in a conversation where they asked, how can we make sure that people with disabilities know about FMLA? And I had to say, well, the majority of people with disabilities who do work, which is a very small number, do not work in jobs where FMLA is available to them, because we are more likely to work part-time or for smaller companies that do not provide these benefits. And so we need to think, when we think about disability employment, we not only need to think about removing these deep-seated barriers that prevent even an attempt to get a first job, an attempt to get a paying internship, but also the barriers that keep disabled people from advancing in their careers and from building our futures. And there are things that we can do at the federal level, like changing who qualifies for FMLA, but also be in conversation with employers who have established really progressive, solid FMLA policies that allow people to work part-time, or who allow people to take off time for chosen family, not just biological family, which disabled people, queer people all often rely on.
I love that call to action, in particular, your call out of the role that a corporate voice can bring to the conversation in working together to really make sure that we're all benefiting from the talent that is available in every community. So I want to continue in conversation with the three of you for the rest of time, but we don't have the rest of time. So I want to shift a little bit and try to get to cover a couple things sort of faster. So I would say put on our running shoes, but I don't do that. So we'll instead put on our metaphorical fast pass track and try to dive in. And I'm going to ask you a couple questions right in a row. The first one is really would love if you could call out anything that's been a big success recently that's making good change. And I love the call out because we have an international audience. So we can take sort of the success that may have existed in one place and try to apply it to another place. So I'm looking at the room. Does anybody have a success that they want to highlight?
I'm happy to jump in. I wanted to uplift the Inflation Reduction Act that I think had some really positive benefits for our community, particularly the caps on cost for prescription, out-of-pocket cost for prescription drugs for Medicare beneficiaries that President Biden spoke about, the State of the Union, the fact that it included capping insulin at $35 per month out of pocket, I think was a really good start and a historic investment in a large segment of the disability community.
Awesome. Alejandro, looks like you've got something.
Oh, go ahead, Alejandro.
As you want, Maria, go ahead.
I was going to call out telehealth. The pandemic, we saw a boon of telehealth, greater flexibility from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. And gratefully, in the Inflation Reduction Act, we saw a preservation of those telehealth flexibilities. We continued to see them in the omnibus that passed in December. And so I love this new world of being able to talk to my doctor online and not having to navigate inaccessible transit to go to a physical. So I'll pass it to you, Alejandro.
Thanks. The success we had recently was the creation of the so-called Accessible EU Center. Basically, we looked at the US and when the Commission asked the disability community what kind of measure they could include in the disability strategy for the next decade, we said, given that we have all these, accessibility legislation that I mentioned before, the Accessibility Act and others, we thought, why don't we create a European agency on accessibility as you have in the US with the US Access Board? And the Commission liked the idea, but given that they didn't have the legal basis for now, they instead of creating a new agency, they have they will launch a big resource center to build the capacity of all players on accessibility policies. That's hope is very helpful to implement all these laws that we've recently have adopted.
Awesome. So that was fun. So let's keep going. One thing that I'm incredibly passionate about and have had the opportunity to work with at Microsoft in partnership with other parts of our company, in particular, our partner organization called Democracy Forward here at Microsoft, is voting and making sure that everyone, and everyone means everyone with a disability, has the right to participate in our democracies. So I would love to hear from you about what needs to be done to improve accessibility for voting.
I just, on this one, I really wanted to shine a light on the fact that we are still seeing anti-voting legislation coming through state legislatures across the country, but particularly here in the South. We've got a bill right now in Georgia that would make it more difficult after SB 202 is signed into law, a law that made it more difficult for people in our state in Georgia to vote, particularly Black and brown people, particularly disabled people. There is now even more that they would like to do to make voting harder, and particularly making it easier to do mass voter challenges. So I think in order to make voting more accessible, we have to also recognize the fact that there are bad actors who would like to make voting more difficult for everybody, and that impacts our community disproportionately. So I'm hoping we can shine a light more on the fact that we have not moved past the fact that there are attacks on our voting and our democracy, that we really need to act on that.
Maria, anything to add?
Yes. So there is no one way to be disabled, and there should be no one way to vote. And we need every state and county in the United States to have a variety of ways for our citizens to cast their ballots, and all of those ways need to be accessible. I have cerebral palsy, Dom has cerebral palsy, and guess what? Our experiences with our disabilities are very different from one another. Dom might prefer to go vote in person. I love using ballot boxes. And in some states, we're seeing an increase in the availability of voter methods, and in some states, we're seeing them being restricted. But at the federal level, AAPD is engaged in a really tough conversation about a push around paper ballots and restrictions on remote voting. We are still in a pandemic. There are elections happening all of the time. Disabled people should not have to risk our health and safety to go have our voice heard in our democracy. Right now, the United States allows members of our military and their families to vote remotely. And if these systems are good enough for our military, why can't they be good enough for disabled people?
Alejandro, any EU perspective on voting?
Yes. Actually, this is one of my. I get really passionate about this campaign on political participation, because in the EU is quite challenging, as we have, let's say, basically 27 different ways of different voting systems. Even if we have European elections, and we will have them soon in 2024. And I would like to go a step further and mention one of the key problems that we are always addressing and raising awareness about. And this is the fact that, for example, in the last European election, there were approximately 400,000 people with disabilities who were denied the right to vote. And this is due to legal incapacitation, that this situation can still happen in 14 member states, and only 8 countries actually ensure the right to stand as candidate, regardless of your legal capacity status. So we are supporting electoral reforms along with our members at national level, and also trying to push for a stronger European electoral law that ensures that everyone has the political rights, regardless of legal capacity status. And millions simply cannot vote and participate in the election because of all the accessibility barriers and the practical barriers. And Maria mentioned it very well. We have we recently published, and I can share the link in the chat, a comparative study. Every year we do a comparative study on a topic concerning the CRPD, the convention, and last year was political participation. This year will be precisely employment, of what we were discussing. And a key aspect, key elements that we highlighted and we found out throughout member states is that accessibility needs to be maximized in collaboration with organizations of persons with disabilities, and in those countries in which they cooperated to really address the accessibility barriers, the solutions were really outstanding and the results were really good. But having not only this accessibility features of the election, regardless if you vote with internet like in Estonia, with a voting machine like here in Belgium, with a ballot box like in Spain. So maximize accessibility, but then, as Maria mentioned, to really enable alternative ways of voting, and ensuring that persons with disabilities can choose a person to assist them in voting. This is something that, unfortunately, still in 2 European countries, persons with disabilities cannot vote with a person of trust. They need to be held by a stranger, a polling officer, which obviously forces the person to reveal the vote, and then it's not secret. So we gather all these findings in the report, which I will share with you in the chat. Thank you very much.
So I
Sorry, it was
love our
long.
shared, no, I love our shared passion. It really speaks to how critical and important it is to each of us and to each person globally to have that right to participate in democracy. We are painfully out of time. So just painfully for me. So I just wanted to thank you all so much for being here, for engaging in this conversation. As we wrap up on the screen, there will be a great slide. It's just absolutely fantastic because it has the link to each organization. So you each can continue the conversation by reaching out to EDF, to AAPD, and to New Disabled South and engage in the work that they're doing, learn more about the policies that they're working on and how all of our voices can be part of creating policy change to address the disability divide. So I want to thank you each for being here. I want to thank you for this conversation. And I want to thank everybody who is listening and engaging with us today for bringing their voice, their perspective, and their energy to helping to create the policy change that we're all in support of. So thank you very much.
Contact information for panelists' organizations: European Disability Forum, edf-feph.org; New Disabled South, newdisabledsouth.org; AAPD, American Association of People with Disabilities, aapd.com.